Okay, so we have Uglin and Henderson, Law versus Ethics. Basically, it's who is a journalist, why does it matter, disentangling the legal and ethical arguments, which is kind of an amusing title because they deliberately entangle these two things in order to give a structure which can then be cross-section. Actually, more like this way, structure that can then be cross-section, but it's sort of meritorious approach to what's a second-level journalist and a first-level journalist, and so on. This study was released in 2007. We've definitely seen something that was starting then and has continued, which is the social media explosion, which has kind of precluded the whole argument of, who is allowed to talk, who is assigned weight when they're talking, by introducing this whole stream of media entertainment and entertainers that aren't restricted by any sort of title of whether or not they're a journalist. So I think that a lot of this is moot point, but it certainly gives us a framework to address issues like responsibility versus accountability, and the tension between being an entertaining journalist and truth telling, in the democratic role, and how it's certainly assigned more to journalism now as it's taken more seriously with this subsection of entertainer being there. And then also a little bit the special challenges for embedded journalists, even if they're simply embedded by giving passes to politicians, etc. So, what are the two domains for journalism? Um, how is identity complicated? And what are the contexts for law and ethics? That all comes into play defining a journalist. Rather than defining them by form, as with a scientist, journalists are defined here by function. They're overseen by their employers in a similar way that boards are, but their access is defined by their subjects, and that's certainly not something that happens in science. Those subjects vet them and issue passes. So that creates this meritorious structure that isn't present with scientists. They're just, whether or not you can get a college to support you, whether or not you can get the grant, and then you're overseen by either the government or a board. So it's a little bit different. It's kind of cool because you actually have this, as previously mentioned, this egalitarianism, which is pushed by the Constitution to be open and to be to seek to speak out, and also by communitarianism, which is to serve the community by educating them, etc. So, what's the deal with law versus professional ethics insofar as journalism is concerned? Legal measures restrict and prosecute print and media and the people who create it, and that's kind of the important tension point. Is can this get you sued? Can this get you thrown in jail? That's a big deal. Professional bodies regulate that media which is created and maintain some control over its regulation before it enters the sphere of law. So, in that way, they function like a board where they kind of say, hey, this is my responsibility, and they keep their little scrap of nowhere. And that gives you a measure of protection, especially the higher up in the field you go, because these people aren't going to let this even hit the press if it's going to be a problem. So, that's actually a little bit of a safety buffer there. The motivating factor is law versus ethics. This is kind of the big content in the course, and I think where some of it gets very confusing. Legally, journalism is encouraged to be autonomous, reasonable, and self-determining. That is really a big deal in ethics. Most specifically, Nicomachean ethics, which is by Aristotle, focuses on the individual and their ability to find balance in between the two possible extremes of any action, activity, emotion, etc. That places ethics firmly in the realm of the individual. What should I do versus morality, which is what should we do? And I think these things get very often confused in these papers. Because they use ethics and morality interchangeable, and that's not the case. We're not trying to figure out, when you talk ethics, what should everybody do. That's something that is necessarily situationally based, and it's for a very large group of people. Law is political. That's directly translatable as the appropriate use of force. Ethics is individual. So awesome. They're autonomous, they're reasonable, they're self-determining. So that's great. That gives us the very sphere that ethics fits into. Ethically, a journalist is responsible for their own safety, the safety of the public domain, and the education thereof. That's kind of a big responsibility, and the educational part is a little bit sketchy. It's certainly the case that media bias towards the safety of the public domain, or even just giving in to the pressures of advertisers and the government, is certainly an issue that is openly it's a hot topic, and that's a good thing because this is actually showing us exactly where ethics enters into play in journalism. Debatably, they're also responsible for entertaining the above mentioned. If you can't keep someone's attention, you probably won't move up, and that's why it's awesome that since the introduction of the entertainer with the push of social media, we actually have this meritorious ladder that you can climb up, where his second level journalist and his first level journalist don't have to do with ethics per se, except insofar as you carry out the duties of implied by those ethics. Domain's a restriction. They aren't too bad. Constitutional law is egalitarian. It's very much, especially in the United States of America, about speaking out. And definitely Freedom of Information Act, getting all of that out there. Statutory law is occupationally focused, and you do have that security blanket of whoever you work for and whoever has issued you the pass. So you will generally know exactly where those restrictions are, and you do generally have an oversight so a body that essentially checks your work before it goes out. Informal privileges granted by subjects are politically focused. Like I said, you will be generally granted passes, etc. That's the one time that subjects really come into play, and so journalists are naturally embedded, and that becomes more and more and more the case as they move outside of their home sphere. Professional ethics is presented by Ogun as public domain, but it's enforced by privatized corporations. And that's where he and I start to kind of divide, because he trends towards a morality where I have a very deep understanding of literally exactly what ethics is, and so I'll naturally disagree with him. Tiers of responsibility and definition. Due to the classification, Uglin proposed tiers of levels of responsibility and culpability. If you're a first level journalist, you have to yay, yay, and yay. I say it the other way around. You'll never get to write for the Washington Post unless you have proven to be ethical, unless you have proven to already meet these criteria. And it's because we now do have these entertainers who have access to their own media, and they don't need oversight, and they're out there and they're doing whatever, in YouTubing and so on. So we have this freedom in journalism that we didn't have before, where you just either succeed or fail. So you can just class them as a journalist or an entertainer. If they're an entertainer, they don't have the same kind of protections that a journalist does, because they don't have the same kind of responsibilities. With that responsibility, all of a sudden comes the accountability that we're looking for, now that it's classed this way. It coincides with Oakland's ultimate statement that journalism is a meritorious occupation, not an inclusive one. But he would oppose the alternate approach because he says there's two domains, legal and ethical. I say that's politics and ethics. He says they need to be studying of the public a place in deciding what a journalist is. I disagree. Journalist is an occupation. We don't say what a doctor is. There's just a certain amount of rigorous testing that you have to go through in order to obtain that title. We're in a field that requires mastery. Our MS is in communications. We have to jump through a certain set of hoops and a certain set of people, the board, who is accredited, who allows us to graduate, and that's simply the case in every field, I feel, and that I just think that the emergence of the entertainer has delineated this in a way that Uglin wouldn't, which doesn't make his topics any less interesting or researchable, simply that they would be structured differently.